Samuel Pritchard arrived in Charleston, South Carolina, in April of 1819, with 3 leather trunks containing his possessions, a letter of introduction from a textile merchant in Boston, and a particular philosophy about discipline that he'd developed during his years managing factory workers in New England. He was 30 years old, unmarried, and possessed of the kind of lean, nervous energy that made other men uncomfortable in his presence. His eyes were a pale gray that seemed to look through people rather than at them, and his hands, though not particularly large, had a strength that surprised those who shook them. The letter of introduction secured him a meeting with several plantation owners in the Charleston area. Pritchard had no experience with agriculture, but he understood systems, efficiency, and what he called the proper application of motivation. After 3 weeks of interviews, he accepted a position as assistant overseer on the Belmont plantation, 20 miles inland from Charleston, where rice and indigo made fortunes for those willing to extract them from the humid South Carolina lowlands. The owner, William Belmont, was 61 years old and increasingly troubled by gout that made walking difficult. He spent most of his time in his Charleston townhouse, leaving the daily operations of his plantation to hired men. The head overseer was a man named Cyrus Hatch, who'd held the position for 12 years and ran things with what Belmont considered excessive leniency. Production has declined for 3 consecutive years, Belmont explained to Pritchard during their final interview, conducted in a Charleston office that overlooked the harbor. Hatch is too familiar with the workers. He remembers names, asks about families. This is not how you maintain discipline. I need someone who understands that a plantation is a business, not a charity. Pritchard nodded, his pale eyes fixed on Belmont with an intensity that might have been mistaken for enthusiasm. I understand completely, sir. In the textile mills, I learned that productivity requires clarity. Clear rules, clear consequences, clear execution. Sentiment has no place in proper management. Belmont smiled for the first time in the interview. I believe we'll work well together, Mr. Pritchard. Among the 263 enslaved people at Belmont Plantation was a man named Marcus. He'd been born with a different name in a village near the coast of what white men called the Gold Coast, but that name had been taken from him so long ago that even he barely remembered its sound. He was 26 years old in 1819, though he could only estimate this based on fragments of memory and the calculations of others who'd known him longer. Marcus had been sold 6 times in his life, moving from Virginia to North Carolina to South Carolina, each sale separating him further from anything he might have called home or family. His mother had been sold away when he was 7. His father he'd never known. A sister maybe somewhere, but the memory was so faint it might have been imagination. At Belmont Plantation, Marcus worked primarily in the rice fields, where the labor was backbreaking and the threat of disease constant. Rice cultivation required standing in water for hours, managing the complex system of dikes and drains, planting and harvesting in conditions that bred mosquitoes and sickness. Many didn't survive their first year in the rice fields. Marcus had survived 8. He was known among the other enslaved people as someone who kept his head down, who didn't cause trouble, who understood that survival meant making yourself unremarkable. He was neither the strongest nor the weakest, neither the most defiant nor the most compliant. He existed in that middle space where men try to become invisible, to pass through their days without attracting attention from those who held power over their lives. He had friends, after a fashion. An older woman named Ruth, who'd taken him under her protection when he first arrived, teaching him the unwritten rules of survival at Belmont. A man named Joseph, nearly 60, who told stories in the evenings about places he'd been and people he'd known, stories that might have been true or might have been elaborate fictions designed to make the present more bearable. A younger man named Thomas, who worked beside him in the rice fields and sometimes made him laugh despite everything. Marcus also had something unusual. He could read. His first owner in Virginia had been a widow who taught her own children their letters, and Marcus, serving in the house at the time, had watched and listened and taught himself in secret. It was dangerous knowledge. Enslaved people caught reading could be punished severely, so he kept it hidden. But sometimes, late at night, he would trace letters in the dirt floor of his cabin, practicing, remembering, keeping that small part of himself alive. When Samuel Pritchard arrived at Belmont Plantation on a warm May morning, Marcus was among the field workers assembled for inspection. This was Cyrus Hatch's doing. He wanted the new assistant overseer to see the workforce, to understand the people he'd be helping to manage. Hatch was a large man, weathered by years in the sun, with a face that could be hard when necessary but more often looked merely tired. Pritchard walked slowly down the line of assembled workers, examining each person with the same expression he might have used when reviewing machinery. His eyes lingered on some, passed quickly over others, and he asked occasional questions in a flat, emotionless voice. When he reached Marcus, he stopped. "What's your name?" "Marcus, sir." "How long have you been here?" 8 years, sir." "And what is your primary work?" "Rice fields, sir." Pritchard studied him for a long moment, his pale eyes moving from Marcus's face to his hands to his posture and back. "Look at me when you speak." Marcus raised his eyes. Pritchard's gaze was unsettling in its intensity, as if he were trying to see through Marcus's skull into his thoughts. After several seconds, Pritchard nodded once and continued down the line. That evening, Marcus mentioned the encounter to Ruth while they ate their rations outside the cabins. The sky was deepening from blue to purple, and somewhere in the distance, someone was singing a work song in a low, mournful voice. "That new overseer," Marcus said. "There's something wrong with him." Ruth looked up from her bowl. "Wrong how?" "I don't know. The way he looks at people, like we're not people at all. Most of them look at us that way." "Not like this," Marcus insisted. "Hatch, he's hard sometimes, but you can see he knows we're human. This new one, Pritchard, it's like he's already decided we're something else entirely." Ruth was quiet for a moment, then said, "Then be more careful around him. Don't give him reasons to notice you." It was good advice, and Marcus tried to follow it. But over the following weeks, as Pritchard settled into his role as assistant overseer, it became clear that being unnoticed might not be possible. Pritchard had ideas about efficiency, about productivity, about discipline. He kept detailed records of every worker's output, measuring and comparing and finding patterns. He identified who worked fastest, who worked slowest, who took breaks and how often. And he had strong opinions about Cyrus Hatch's management style. "You're too lenient with them," Pritchard told Hatch one evening in June. They were in the overseer's cabin reviewing the day's work. "They take advantage of your familiarity." Hatch frowned. "I've been running this plantation for 12 years. Production has been steady until the last few years, and that decline has more to do with soil depletion than labor." "I disagree. The problem is insufficient motivation. You need to establish clearer consequences for insufficient work. These are people, Pritchard, not machines. You push them too hard, you break them. And broken workers don't produce anything." Pritchard's expression didn't change. "I've found that people respond quite well to consistent application of appropriate incentives. In the mills, we had very clear productivity standards. Those who met them were left alone. Those who didn't were corrected. This isn't a mill. The principles are the same." The conversation ended there, but Marcus, who was delivering water to the overseer's cabin and heard the exchange through the open window, felt a chill despite the warm evening. He understood what Pritchard meant by corrected, what he meant by appropriate incentives. Everyone understood. The first major incident came in July. A young woman named Sarah, who worked in the house rather than the fields, broke a china plate while serving dinner to Cyrus Hatch. It was an accident, the kind of small mishap that happened regularly. Hatch typically handled such things with a reprimand and perhaps extra work duties. But Pritchard was present when it happened, and he had different ideas. "This is exactly what I've been talking about," Pritchard said, standing from the table. "Carelessness needs immediate correction, or it spreads." "Pritchard, it was an accident," Hatch began. "There are no accidents, only insufficient attention to one's duties." Pritchard turned to Sarah, who stood frozen, terrified. Outside. Now. What followed was 15 lashes, administered by Pritchard himself using a whip he'd borrowed from the stable. Sarah's cries carried across the plantation yard, and everyone who heard them understood that something had changed. Cyrus Hatch stood watching, his face dark with anger, but he didn't intervene. Pritchard was assistant overseer, and he had the authority to maintain discipline as he saw fit. Afterward, as Sarah lay weeping in her cabin and Ruth tended her wounds, the whispers spread through the quarters. The new overseer was different, dangerous. They needed to be more careful, more vigilant, more afraid. Marcus lay in his cabin that night and listened to those whispers, and he felt something cold settling into his bones. He'd survived 8 years at Belmont by understanding the rules, by knowing what was expected and what would be tolerated. But Pritchard was changing those rules, making everything uncertain and unpredictable. The situation deteriorated over the following months. Pritchard pushed for harsher punishments, longer work hours, more rigid standards. He wanted to implement a quota system for the rice fields, where each worker would be assigned a specific amount to harvest daily, with punishments for those who fell short. Hatch resisted this, arguing it was unrealistic given the variable conditions in the fields, but Pritchard was persistent. "Mr. Belmont hired me to improve productivity," Pritchard said during one of their increasingly frequent arguments. "Every suggestion I make, you block. How am I supposed to do my job? Your job is to assist me, not to undermine my authority." Hatch shot back. "Then perhaps your authority needs to be reconsidered." The confrontation reached William Belmont's ears in late September. He summoned both overseers to Charleston for a meeting. What was said in that meeting, no one on the plantation knew for certain, but when they returned, the power dynamic had shifted. Pritchard had been promoted to co-overseer, with authority equal to Hatch's. The plantation was to be divided, with Pritchard managing the field workers and Hatch managing the house staff and maintenance. Marcus heard this news with a sinking feeling. The rice fields, his domain, would now be under Pritchard's direct control. The whip arrived in October. Pritchard had it specially made by a leather worker in Charleston, according to his own precise specifications. It was 5 feet long, braided from treated cowhide, with a handle wrapped in cord for better grip and a small brass fitting at the base. The craftsman who made it was an old man named Wilhelm, who'd been making such implements for 40 years, serving the plantation owners and overseers who needed tools for their particular trade. Wilhelm later told his wife that there was something unsettling about Pritchard's order. "Most men who come to me, they don't want to think too much about what they're ordering. They describe what they need, I make it, they pay and leave. But this Pritchard fellow, he had drawings, detailed specifications. He knew exactly what he wanted, the weight, the length, the flexibility. He tested the balance multiple times before he was satisfied. Maybe he just wants it done right," Wilhelm's wife suggested. "No," Wilhelm said slowly. "It wasn't about getting it right. It was about designing something specific, like an engineer designing a tool for a particular job. Made my skin crawl, truth be told." The whip made its debut on a Thursday morning in October, when a man named David was accused of deliberately working slowly in the rice fields. Whether the accusation was true or false didn't matter. Pritchard had decided to make an example. The punishment was administered in the center of the work area, with all the field workers forced to stop and watch. 20 lashes. Pritchard's technique was methodical, each strike landing with the same force, the same interval, like a clock ticking. His expression never changed. He didn't seem angry or passionate or even particularly interested. He was simply performing a task that needed to be performed. Marcus watched from his position in the assembled group, his face carefully blank, his hands clenched at his sides. He'd seen whippings before. They were a regular feature of plantation life, as common as rain. But there was something different about this. The previous overseer who'd occasionally used the whip had done so in anger, in frustration, in moments of lost control. Pritchard wielded it with the calm precision of a craftsman, and somehow that was more terrifying than rage would have been. After it was finished, after David had been taken away to have his wounds tended, Pritchard cleaned the whip carefully with a cloth, examining the braided leather for any signs of damage. Then, he hung it on a hook outside his cabin where everyone could see it. It would hang there, visible to all who passed by, for the next 7 years. The pattern established itself quickly. Pritchard ran the field operations with mechanical efficiency, and the whip was his primary tool for maintaining that efficiency. Anyone who failed to meet expectations, who showed any sign of resistance, who made the smallest mistake, could expect to feel its impact. Pritchard kept meticulous records in a leather-bound ledger: the date, the person's name, the offense, the number of lashes, and his observations about changes in behavior afterward. Marcus avoided the whip for the first 11 months. He worked hard, kept his thoughts to himself, met every quota, attracted no particular attention. He watched others suffer under it. Thomas received 15 lashes for allegedly stealing food, though he'd merely picked up an apple that had fallen from a tree. An older woman named Grace received 10 lashes for being late to the fields because she'd been caring for her sick grandchild. A young man named Benjamin received 25 lashes for talking back to Pritchard, though what he'd actually said was just a quiet "yes, sir" that Pritchard had interpreted as insufficiently respectful. The whip accumulated its history. Each person who felt it became part of its story. The leather darkened with use, the handle became worn and smooth from Pritchard's grip, and it developed a reputation among the enslaved workers that went beyond its physical properties. They spoke of it in whispers in the evenings, attributing to it qualities that seemed to transcend mere leather and cord. "That whip has a taste for us," said Joseph one night, his voice barely audible. "It drinks our pain." "Don't be foolish," Ruth said, though her voice was uncertain. "It's just a tool. The evil is in the man who uses it, not the thing itself." "Maybe," Joseph said, "but I've lived long enough to know that some objects carry weight beyond their making. That whip, it knows every one of us now. It's marked too many people not to remember." Marcus didn't believe in such things, or told himself he didn't, but he couldn't deny that there was something about the whip that commanded attention when it hung on its hook, something that made it seem more present than other objects. Even when Pritchard wasn't using it, you could feel its potential, waiting. Marcus's first encounter with the whip came in September of 1821, 16 months after Pritchard had acquired it. The rice fields required constant maintenance of the complex system of dikes and drainage channels that controlled water flow. Marcus was working on repairing a section of dike that had been damaged by heavy rain when he noticed a structural problem with Pritchard's planned repair approach. The method Pritchard had ordered would fix the immediate break, but would make the dike more vulnerable to future flooding. Marcus had seen similar repairs fail before. He hesitated, knowing that offering suggestions to Pritchard was dangerous, but the repair would take significant time and labor, and if it failed, they'd have to do it all again. After an internal debate, he approached Pritchard with his observation. "Sir, about the dike repair." Pritchard looked up from his notebook where he was recording the day's work. "What about it?" "The approach you've outlined will work in the short term, but the water pressure during the next heavy rain will likely cause—" "Stop." Pritchard's voice was flat. "Did I ask for your assessment?" "No, sir, but I've seen repairs like this fail before, and I thought—" "You thought. You thought." Pritchard closed his notebook slowly. "What makes you believe your thoughts are relevant to me?" "I just wanted to—" "You wanted to demonstrate that you're smarter than me, that you understand engineering better than I do, that your judgment should override mine." Pritchard's pale eyes fixed on Marcus with that unsettling intensity. "This is exactly the kind of insubordination that undermines discipline." "Sir, I didn't mean 15 lashes tomorrow morning. Maybe that will teach you the proper limits of your role here." Marcus felt his stomach drop. He'd been trying to help, trying to save time and labor, and he'd walked directly into punishment. He opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. Anything he said would only make things worse. That evening, Ruth found him sitting outside his cabin, staring at nothing. She sat down beside him without speaking. After a long silence, Marcus said, "I was just trying to help." "I know. The repair is going to fail. We'll have to do it again in a month." "Probably," Ruth agreed, "but that doesn't matter to him. What matters is that you suggested he was wrong. You challenged his authority. That's the only thing he heard. So we just let him make mistakes, even when those mistakes cost us more work." Ruth looked at him sadly. "We survive, Marcus. That's all we can do. We survive, and we hope that someday things change. But you can't change things by getting yourself killed, and that's what will happen if you keep challenging him." The whipping took place the next morning at dawn, before the workday began. Pritchard had Marcus's shirt removed, revealing a back that had been unmarked by whips until that moment. Marcus had worked at Belmont for 9 years without ever receiving such punishment. That record ended now. The first strike of the whip felt like fire across his shoulders. Marcus had braced himself, had tried to prepare mentally, but the reality was worse than he'd imagined. The second strike crossed the first, creating a burning X pattern. The third, fourth, fifth, each one worse, as the leather found flesh that was already damaged, already raw. By the 10th lash, Marcus was gritting his teeth so hard he thought they might crack. He wouldn't scream. He wouldn't give Pritchard that satisfaction. But his body betrayed him with small sounds, with involuntary shudders, with the trembling that he couldn't control. The 15th and final lash landed low on his back, and then it was over. Pritchard cleaned his whip with his usual care, while Marcus stood there shaking, blood running down his back. Then Pritchard spoke in that same flat, emotionless voice. "You're expected in the fields in 15 minutes. Don't be late." Ruth and 2 other women cleaned Marcus's wounds with water and rags, working quickly so he could get to the fields on time. Every movement was agony, but he worked through the day because the alternative was more punishment. That night, lying face down on his pallet while Ruth applied a poultice of herbs to his back, Marcus felt something inside himself begin to change. A hardness was forming, a cold understanding that survival alone might not be enough. Over the next 3 years, Marcus received the whip 4 more times. Once for being insufficiently quick to respond to an order. Pritchard had called for him while Marcus was in the middle of lifting a heavy sack of rice, and he'd finished the lift before responding, which Pritchard interpreted as deliberate delay. 10 lashes. Once for a broken tool, the handle of a rice-cutting blade snapped during use, which was not uncommon with old equipment, but Pritchard blamed Marcus for applying too much force. 12 lashes. Once for helping an older man named Samuel, who'd collapsed from heat exhaustion in the fields. Pritchard's logic was that by helping Samuel, Marcus was implicitly suggesting that Samuel wasn't capable of doing his assigned work, which undermined discipline. 15 lashes, and once for no reason that Marcus could ever determine. Pritchard simply called him out one morning, had him brought to the punishment area, and administered 8 lashes without explanation. When it was over, and Marcus, confused and bleeding, asked what he'd done wrong, Pritchard just looked at him coldly and said, "Preventive correction. I've noted a slight decline in your productivity this week." After that 4th whipping, Marcus began to dream about the whip. In his dreams it moved with its own will, independent of Pritchard's hand. It would coil like a snake, strike like lightning, seeking him out no matter where he tried to hide. He would wake in darkness, his back aching from old scars, and lie there wondering if he was losing his mind. But he wasn't the only one dreaming of it. Throughout the quarters, people spoke about the whip in hushed tones, their words carrying the weight of shared trauma. They'd all seen it, felt it, or knew someone who had. It had become more than just an instrument. It was a symbol, a presence, almost a living thing in their collective consciousness. 247, Joseph said one evening in late 1823, his voice barely a whisper. The number hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "What?" Marcus asked. "That's how many times he's used it." "I've been counting. 247 times over 3 years. Some people once, some people multiple times. But 247 separate whippings. Marcus felt sick. Why are you counting? Because somebody should. Somebody should remember. Maybe that's all we can do. Remember and hope that someday, somehow, there's an accounting. The whip continued its work. In 1824, a young woman named Hannah tried to escape. She made it nearly 12 miles before she was caught and returned. Pritchard ordered 50 lashes to be administered over 5 days, 10 each morning, so that she would spend each day working in the fields with fresh wounds that hadn't begun to heal. The cruelty was calculated, designed not just to punish her but to break something essential inside her and to terrify everyone else. Marcus watched the first morning's punishment and felt something fundamental shift inside himself. It wasn't rage exactly, though rage was part of it. It wasn't despair, though that was present too. It was more like a sudden clarity, a recognition that he'd been trying to survive inside a system that was designed to make survival impossible on any terms that preserved human dignity. The realization left him feeling oddly detached, as if he were watching his own life from a distance. That night, he spoke to Ruth. How much longer can any of us bear this? Ruth was silent for a long time. She was older now, her hair gone grey, her hands gnarled from decades of work. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than sad. Some people bear it until they die. Some people stop bearing it and die sooner. And some people... She trailed off, then shook her head. I don't know what some people do, Marcus. I've lived 59 years and I still don't know. What would happen if someone killed him? Ruth's eyes widened. Don't talk like that. Don't even think like that. But what would happen? They'd kill whoever did it. Slow and public to make sure everyone understood the lesson. And they'd probably kill others too, just to make the point clear. You know that. Marcus nodded slowly. He did know that. But the question wouldn't leave his mind, and over the following months it would return again and again, each time with more urgency, more detail, more possibility. The opportunity, when it finally came, arrived disguised as duty. It was November of 1825, 6 years after Pritchard had first arrived at Belmont Plantation. Cyrus Hatch had left the previous year, unable to continue working under the conditions Pritchard had created. William Belmont had promoted Pritchard to head overseer, giving him complete control of the plantation's daily operations. Production had increased, which was all Belmont cared about, though the cost in human suffering never appeared in his accounting books. Pritchard had been suffering from a fever for 4 days, something he'd picked up during a trip to Charleston. He was well enough to still perform his duties, but he was clearly weakened, moving more slowly than usual, and his judgment seemed affected. His face was pale and damp with perspiration, and he'd been drinking frequently from a flask of whiskey, claiming it helped with the fever. On the afternoon of November 12th, Pritchard had Marcus brought to his cabin. This was unusual. Field workers were typically supervised in the fields, not summoned to the overseer's private space. Marcus approached with caution, uncertain what to expect. Pritchard was sitting in a chair by his desk, looking worse than he had that morning. I need someone to go to Charleston tomorrow, he said, his voice slightly hoarse. There's a package to collect from Dr. Morrison's office. Medicine for this fever. Mr. Belmont has arranged for it. This was highly unusual. Pritchard typically sent other overseers or trusted house servants on such errands, not field workers. But the fever had apparently disrupted his normal patterns, and there were no other overseers available. The assistant overseers were managing other tasks. Yes, sir, Marcus said. You'll leave at dawn, take the mule. The package will be ready. Be back by evening. Pritchard paused, studying Marcus with those unsettling pale eyes. Don't make me regret choosing you for this. No, sir. Marcus turned to leave, but as he did, his eyes fell on the whip, hanging on its hook beside the door. In 6 years it had hung there, visible to everyone who passed, a constant reminder of Pritchard's authority. The leather was darker now, stained and worn from use. The handle was smooth where Pritchard's hands had gripped it countless times. Pritchard followed his gaze, and something like a smile crossed his face, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That whip has educated a lot of people," he said, his voice slightly slurred from fever and whiskey. "Including you, if I recall correctly. How many times was it? 5, 6? He seemed to find this amusing. "I lose count sometimes, so many lessons to teach." Marcus felt heat rising in his face, but he kept his expression neutral. "Yes, sir. You know what's interesting?" Pritchard continued, perhaps made talkative by fever and drink. "I've kept records. Every punishment, every person, every number of lashes. It's all written down in my ledger. Do you know why I do that?" "No, sir. Because discipline requires consistency. You can't be arbitrary. You have to have rules, standards, documentation. That's what separates proper management from mere cruelty." He gestured vaguely at his desk, where the leather-bound ledger sat. "Everything is recorded. A complete history." Marcus said nothing. What was there to say? That Pritchard's careful documentation didn't make his actions any less horrific? That applying systematic methods to brutality didn't elevate it to something respectable? These thoughts remained locked inside, dangerous and unspoken. "Go on then," Pritchard said, waving dismissively. "Remember, dawn, don't be late." That night Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay on his pallet in the darkness, his mind churning. The trip to Charleston tomorrow represented something unusual. Time away from the plantation, distance from direct supervision, a break in the normal routine. It was the kind of opportunity that people dreamed about, the kind that might allow for escape. But he'd seen what happened to runners who were caught. The punishments were designed to be worse than death, to make examples that would haunt the survivors' dreams. And the chances of successful escape were slim, particularly for a man traveling alone on a borrowed mule in broad daylight with no resources and no destination. And yet, his mind kept returning to the whip hanging by Pritchard's door, to the ledger on the desk documenting years of systematic cruelty, to Pritchard's words about education and consistency, to the fact that the overseer was weakened by fever, alone in his cabin, his reflexes and judgment impaired. An idea began to form, so dangerous and unlikely that Marcus almost dismissed it immediately, but it wouldn't leave his mind. Through the dark hours before dawn, it grew and developed, becoming more detailed, more possible, more terrible. By the time the first light appeared in the eastern sky, Marcus had made his decision. The trip to Charleston went exactly as planned. Marcus collected the medicine from Dr. Morrison's office, a tincture of some kind, in a brown glass bottle with a cork stopper. The doctor asked no questions, and Marcus volunteered no information. He ate the small ration of food he'd brought, watered the mule, and began the journey back. But instead of returning directly to the plantation, he took a detour through a section of dense woods along the Edisto River. There, working quickly, he found what he needed. A thick branch, roughly the same length and weight as Pritchard's whip. He stripped it of smaller branches and bark, working until it was relatively smooth. It wouldn't pass close inspection, but in dim light from a distance it might be convincing enough. He wrapped the branch in cloth torn from his shirt and hid it in the underbrush near one of the paths between the fields and Pritchard's cabin, in a spot he could easily find again after dark. Then he continued back to the plantation. Pritchard was waiting, sitting on the steps of his cabin despite the evening chill. He still looked ill, but his eyes were alert and suspicious. "You took your time. The doctor was with another patient, sir. I had to wait." Pritchard studied him for a long moment, then took the medicine bottle. He examined it carefully, as if checking that it hadn't been tampered with. Finally, he nodded. "Get some food, then report to the quarters. You've got work tomorrow." "Yes, sir." Marcus had planned to wait, to let days or even weeks pass before attempting anything. The risk was enormous, and rushing would only increase the chances of failure. But that evening, after he'd eaten and was walking back toward his cabin, one of the house servants approached him. "Pritchard wants to see you," she said, her voice nervous. Now, Marcus's heart began to pound. Had someone seen him in the woods? Had his detour been noticed? He walked to Pritchard's cabin with a sense of approaching disaster, his mind racing through possible explanations and denials. Pritchard was inside, sitting at his desk with the ledger open before him. The whip hung on its hook beside the door, as always. A single lamp provided light, casting shadows across Pritchard's face that made his expression hard to read. "Come in. Close the door." Marcus did as ordered, his every sense on high alert. Pritchard tapped the open ledger with one finger. "I've been reviewing my records. Your productivity has declined 11% over the past 2 months. Do you know why that might be?" This was a trap. Any answer Marcus gave would be wrong. If he denied it, he'd be calling Pritchard a liar. If he admitted it, he'd be confessing to insufficient work. If he tried to explain it, he'd be making excuses. "I don't know, sir," Marcus said carefully. "You don't know? Interesting." Pritchard closed the ledger. "I also had a report that you were seen near my cabin this afternoon, when you should have been in the fields after returning from Charleston." This was a lie, or a test, or possibly a genuine misunderstanding. But Marcus knew from long experience that truth didn't matter in situations like this. Pritchard had already decided on the outcome. This was just the formality that preceded it. "That's not correct, sir. I went straight to the fields after giving you the medicine." "Are you calling my source a liar?" The trap was closing. Whatever Marcus said would be wrong. "I'm telling you what happened, sir." Pritchard stood slowly, walked to the door, and lifted the whip from its hook. The leather scraped against itself with a sound that Marcus had learned to hear in his nightmares. "I think you need a reminder about honesty and about the consequences of declining productivity." Pritchard's voice was flat, showing no emotion despite the fever that still clearly affected him. 20 lashes. Tomorrow morning before work begins." "Sir, tomorrow morning, now get out." Marcus left the cabin, his mind reeling. 20 lashes would leave his back raw for days, making work agonizing. But it was more than that. It was the arbitrariness of it, the certainty that he could do nothing right, that Pritchard would always find reasons to use the whip, regardless of Marcus's actions. The system was designed to be inescapable. That night, lying in his cabin, Marcus made his final decision. He'd been planning, considering, hesitating, but Pritchard's announcement had removed any remaining doubt. If he was going to act, it had to be now, before tomorrow's whipping, before he was weakened and injured. He waited until full dark, until the plantation had settled into its uneasy night quiet. The moon was 3/4 full, providing enough light to see by, but creating deep shadows that could hide movement. Marcus rose from his pallet, moving as quietly as possible to avoid waking the others in his cabin. Outside, the November air was cold and damp. He could hear the river in the distance, the sound of water moving over rocks. An owl called from somewhere in the trees. Marcus moved through the shadows, using every trick he'd learned in 10 years of trying to be invisible, trying to avoid notice. He retrieved the wrapped branch from where he'd hidden it, checking to make sure it hadn't been discovered or disturbed. Then, his heart hammering so hard he was sure everyone must be able to hear it, he approached Pritchard's cabin. The building was dark except for a faint glow from a single lamp burning low inside. Marcus could hear Pritchard's labored breathing, the restless sounds of a man fighting fever even in sleep. He positioned himself beside the door, barely breathing, listening. The whip hung on its hook within reach. Marcus stood there for a long moment, his hand extended but not quite touching the leather. This was the moment of decision. Once he took the whip, there was no going back. Every consequence that followed would trace back to this moment, this choice. He thought about the scars on his back, put there by this whip, and the man who wielded it. He thought about Hannah's broken spirit after her attempted escape and subsequent punishment. He thought about Joseph's count, 247 separate whippings over 6 years. He thought about the systematic documentation in Pritchard's ledger, the careful records of suffering inflicted with mechanical precision. He thought about the fact that tomorrow morning he would feel this whip against his flesh again for the 6th time. and that there would inevitably be a seventh time, an eighth, a ninth, continuing until either he died or something changed. His fingers closed around the handle. The whip was warmer than he'd expected despite the cool night air. For one irrational moment, Marcus could have sworn he felt it pulse in his grip, like something alive responding to his touch. The sensation was so startling that he almost dropped it. But he didn't. He lifted it carefully from its hook, the leather uncoiling as it came free. It was heavier than it looked. The weight of 6 years of use, of 247 punishments, of accumulated suffering that seemed to have soaked into the material itself. He hung the disguised branch in its place. In the darkness, from even a short distance, the substitution wasn't obvious. It would be discovered eventually, but he only needed it to work for a little while. With the real whip coiled around his arm, Marcus crept away from the cabin. He didn't go back to the quarters. Instead, he went to one of the storage buildings where tools were kept. A place where someone might plausibly be working late on repairs or preparing equipment for the next day. And there, hidden in shadows, he waited. Time became strange. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every sound made him flinch. The creak of wood, the scurry of a rat, the distant sound of someone coughing in the quarters. Several times he nearly lost his nerve, nearly put the whip back, and abandoned his plan. The consequences if he was discovered were too horrible to contemplate. But each time he was about to give up, he would look at the whip coiled beside him and remember everything it represented. Every crack of leather against flesh, every cry of pain, every person marked and broken. The weight of that history kept him there, waiting in the darkness. After what seemed like an eternity, he saw lamplight in Pritchard's cabin again. The overseer was awake. Probably his fever worsening or perhaps needing to use the privy. Marcus watched the shadow moving behind the curtain, his breath catching in his throat. This was it. If there was ever going to be an opportunity, it was now. While Pritchard was awake and moving but still weak from fever, while darkness provided cover, while the substitution might still go undiscovered. But how? Marcus turned the problem over in his mind frantically. He couldn't simply walk into the cabin and attack Pritchard. The overseer kept a pistol by his bed and would reach for it at the first sign of threat. And even if Marcus succeeded in overpowering him, even if he managed to kill Pritchard, what then? He'd be caught immediately. His death would be certain and horrific, unless... The plan that formed in Marcus's mind was audacious to the point of madness. It would require timing, courage, and an enormous amount of luck. It would also require making Pritchard believe something that seemed completely plausible, even as it was completely false. Marcus left the storage building and moved through the darkness to Pritchard's cabin. He positioned himself beside the building, against the wall where there were no windows. Then he began to make sounds, quiet at first, then gradually louder. Scratching sounds, scuffling sounds. The kind of sounds made by an animal, or perhaps a person trying to be stealthy but not quite succeeding. Inside the cabin, Pritchard's movements stopped. Marcus could imagine him sitting up, listening, his fevered mind trying to make sense of the sounds. Marcus made more noise, a thump against the wall, as if something had knocked against it. The cabin door opened. Pritchard stood there in his nightshirt, a lamp in one hand and his pistol in the other, squinting into the darkness. His face was flushed with fever and he swayed slightly. "Who's there? Show yourself!" Marcus moved quickly, circling to stay out of the lamplight, making more sounds near the corner of the cabin that led toward the woods. Pritchard turned toward the sounds, moving down the steps. "I said show yourself! I'll shoot!" Marcus had positioned everything carefully. As Pritchard moved to investigate the sounds, walking past the hook where the disguised branch hung, Marcus emerged from the shadows behind him, the real whip uncoiled in his hand. "Looking for this?" Marcus said quietly. Pritchard spun around. His eyes widened as he saw Marcus standing there, the whip held ready. The lamp and pistol were both in Pritchard's hands, but the surprise had thrown off his reaction. "What do you think you're—" Marcus struck. He had no practice with the whip, had never wielded such an instrument in his life. His first attempt was clumsy, the leather wrapping around Pritchard's wrist instead of landing cleanly. But it was enough to make Pritchard drop both the lamp and the pistol. The glass shattered, and the light went out, plunging them into darkness illuminated only by moonlight. Pritchard lunged forward, trying to reach the dropped pistol, but the fever had left him weak and his coordination was poor. Marcus stepped aside and struck again. This time the whip caught Pritchard across the face, opening a cut above his eye. Pritchard cried out and stumbled backward. "You'll hang for this," Pritchard gasped, his hand going to his bleeding face. "They'll hunt you down," and Marcus struck again and again. He was acting on instinct now, fear and rage, and something deeper guiding his arm. The whip seemed to know where to go, how to move, as if it remembered its purpose and was simply being directed by a different hand. Each strike landed with a wet sound, leather against flesh, creating wounds that would have been familiar to anyone who'd ever felt this whip's impact. Pritchard tried to fight back, tried to retreat, tried to call for help, but his weakened state betrayed him at every turn. He stumbled over the steps, fell to his knees, tried to rise and was struck down again. His cries grew weaker, more desperate, dissolving from angry threats into pleas and then into inarticulate sounds of pain and terror. Marcus didn't stop, couldn't stop. 6 years of accumulated suffering, of careful invisibility, of swallowed rage and suppressed humanity were pouring out of him with each strike of the whip. This was the instrument that had marked him 5 times, that had marked 247 others, that had hung beside Pritchard's door like a promise and a threat. Now it was being used for a different purpose, completing a circle that had needed closing. Then, with one particularly vicious strike across Pritchard's throat, everything changed. The sound Pritchard made became a horrible, choking gurgle. He fell forward, both hands going to his neck. Blood, black in the moonlight, poured between his fingers. He tried to speak, to cry out, but only managed wet, gasping sounds. Marcus stood frozen, the whip hanging from his hand, watching Pritchard die. It took several minutes, minutes that seemed to stretch into hours. Pritchard's body convulsed, his legs kicked uselessly, his hands clutched at his ruined throat. His eyes, those pale gray eyes that had looked at Marcus with such cold certainty, now showed only shock and incomprehension, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening to him. When Pritchard finally went still, when the last tremor had passed through his body and he lay motionless in the dirt outside his cabin, Marcus felt something he hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief, not satisfaction or joy or even the release of tension. He felt nothing. A vast emptiness, as if the act of killing had hollowed him out completely. Then reality crashed down on him like a physical weight. He looked at the body lying in a spreading pool of blood. He looked at the whip in his hand, dripping. He looked at the shattered lamp, the dropped pistol, the evidence of struggle scattered across the ground. He looked at the plantation around him, dark and quiet for now, but certain to wake and discover what had happened. What had he done? What had he been thinking? There was no escape from this, no way to make it right, no path forward that didn't end in his own death, probably preceded by torture designed to make him an example that would haunt other people's nightmares. And yet, even as panic threatened to overwhelm him, another part of his mind was working with strange clarity. If he was going to survive the next hour, let alone attempt any kind of escape, he needed to think clearly. He needed a plan. He needed to act quickly and decisively. The first thing was to make it look like something other than murder. Marcus moved quickly, forcing himself to touch Pritchard's body despite the revulsion he felt. He examined the wounds, considering how they might be explained. Then, working in moonlight, he began to rearrange things. He positioned the body to make it appear that Pritchard had fallen from the cabin steps, perhaps while investigating the sounds Marcus had made, perhaps in his fevered confusion. The whip injuries were concentrated on the upper body and face, which might be consistent with such a fall if he'd tumbled down the steps and been struck by the whip he'd been holding. The fatal wound to the throat was the problem, but Marcus positioned a sharp rock near the body, staining it with blood, suggesting Pritchard had landed on it. It wasn't perfect. A careful examination would reveal inconsistencies, but in darkness, with Pritchard's known fever and the broken lamp suggesting disorientation, it might be believable enough to create doubt. And doubt was all Marcus needed. Not certainty that it was an accident, just enough uncertainty to prevent immediate conclusions of murder. Then he addressed the pistol. He wiped it clean and placed it back where it might have fallen if Pritchard had been carrying it, and then dropped it during a fall. The shattered lamp he left where it was. That part of the story was actually true. Pritchard had been carrying it. Finally, Marcus examined himself. His clothes had blood on them, but not much. Most of the blood was on Pritchard's body and the ground. Still, it was too much to risk. He stripped quickly, rolled his clothes into a tight bundle, and used dirt and leaves to temporarily hide them under the cabin. He'd have to retrieve and destroy them later, but for now they needed to be out of sight. Standing naked in the moonlight, his body covered in goosebumps from cold and adrenaline, Marcus realized he was holding the whip, the instrument of so much suffering, now used to end the life of the man who'd wielded it. He couldn't leave it here. It was evidence, and more than that, it felt wrong to leave it beside Pritchard's body as if it belonged there. He walked quickly to the Edisto River, stumbling occasionally in the darkness, his mind still racing with what he'd done and what he needed to do next. When he reached the bank, he stood for a moment looking at the whip in his hands. The leather was stained with blood. The handle was warm from his grip. For one final irrational moment, Marcus thought he felt it pulse, as if acknowledging what had happened, as if satisfied. He threw it as far as he could into the dark water. It disappeared with barely a splash, swallowed by the current. Gone. Marcus stood on the bank for a long moment, shaking from cold and reaction, trying to process what he'd just done. Then he forced himself to move. He went to where spare clothing was stored for field workers, found items that approximately fit, and dressed quickly. Then he retrieved and destroyed his blood-stained clothes, burning them in the remnants of the evening cooking fire and scattering the ashes. The walk back to the quarters was the longest journey of Marcus's life. Every shadow seemed to hide a witness. Every sound was someone who'd discovered what happened, but the plantation remained quiet, unaware. When he reached his cabin, Ruth was waiting just inside the door. She looked at him for a long moment in the darkness, then said simply, "What did you do?" Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. What could he say? How could he explain what he'd done? Why he'd done it? What he was feeling now? "I heard sounds," Ruth continued quietly, "from toward Pritchard's cabin, and you were gone from your pallet." She paused. "Tell me you didn't do what I think you did." "I can't tell you that." Ruth closed her eyes briefly, her face etched with a mixture of fear and something that might have been resignation. Then she opened them and looked directly at Marcus. "Did anyone see you?" "I don't think so." "You don't think so, or you know?" "Oh, I was careful, but I can't be certain." Ruth nodded slowly. She walked to where Marcus's pallet was, examined it, then looked back at him. "Then we have to assume you weren't seen. You were here all night. You were sick, recovering from your back still bothering you from the last time Pritchard used the whip on you. I saw you here. I checked on you. Do you understand?" "Ruth, you don't have to. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Good. Now lie down. Try to rest. Whatever happens tomorrow happens, but tonight you rest." But Marcus couldn't rest. He lay on his pallet in the darkness, his mind unable to stop replaying what had happened. The sound of the whip striking flesh. Pritchard's face in the moonlight, shocked and bleeding. The horrible gurgling sounds as he died. The weight of the whip in Marcus's hand. The splash as it disappeared into the river. He'd killed a man. Not in the heat of passion, not in self-defense, but through deliberate planning and action. He'd taken the instrument of his own oppression and used it to destroy the person who'd wielded it. The act felt simultaneously justified and horrifying, necessary and unforgivable. And now he waited for the consequences that seemed inevitable. Dawn came cold and grey. The morning bell rang as always. People emerged from their cabins and began moving toward their work assignments. Marcus moved with them, trying to appear normal, trying not to show the terror that threatened to overwhelm him with every breath. The discovery came perhaps an hour after dawn. One of the house servants, a woman named Patience, had gone to Pritchard's cabin to deliver breakfast, as she did every morning. Her screams brought others running. Within minutes, the plantation was in chaos. Marcus stood with a group of field workers, watching the activity from a distance, his heart hammering so hard he was sure others could hear it. This was it. This was when they'd figure out what really happened, when someone would remember seeing him near the cabin, when the evidence would point unmistakably to murder and to him. The assistant overseers took charge, ordering everyone to their cabins while they examined the scene. Marcus sat in his cabin with the others, waiting, every moment an agony of anticipation. This was when they'd come for him. This was when it would end. But the hours passed, and no accusation came. By afternoon, a doctor had arrived from Charleston. By evening, a representative of William Belmont had come to take control of the situation. Marcus heard fragments of their conversations, pieces of their conclusions carried on the wind through the thin cabin walls. Clearly fell, the broken lamp suggests. Fever had him disoriented, probably came outside to investigate sounds. Injuries consistent with the fall and perhaps being struck by his own whip as he fell. Tragic accident. But these things happen. They were believing it. They were actually believing it. The next day, William Belmont himself arrived. He viewed the body, spoke with the doctor and the representative, examined the scene, and reached the same conclusion. Samuel Pritchard had died in an accident. A fall brought on by fever and confusion, tragically but not suspiciously. It was unfortunate, but it wasn't murder. The whip was noted as missing, but this too was explained away. Perhaps Pritchard had dropped it during his fall and someone had taken it in the confusion. Perhaps it had been stolen earlier. Perhaps it was somewhere on the property and would turn up eventually. The matter didn't seem important enough to investigate thoroughly. After all, it was just a whip, easily replaced. Marcus maintained his composure through all of this, through the questions and the examinations and the eventual funeral, where he stood with the others and was forced to show respect for a man he'd killed. He answered when spoken to, kept his eyes appropriately downcast, gave no sign of anything unusual. Inside, he was a churning mass of fear and disbelief, waiting for the moment when someone would see through the deception, when the truth would emerge. But that moment never came. Within a week, a new overseer had been hired. A man named Patterson, older than Pritchard, with a different approach to management. Less systematic in his cruelty, more traditional. Patterson brought his own whip, but it was different. Shorter, less precisely crafted. He used it, as overseers did, but without Pritchard's mechanical precision, without that systematic approach to discipline. Life on the plantation continued. The rhythms of work resumed. Pritchard was remembered briefly and then forgotten with remarkable speed, his meticulous records packed away, his methods abandoned in favor of Patterson's different approach. Marcus continued working in the rice fields. His back carried the scars from Pritchard's whip, 5 separate sets of marks that would never fully fade. He spoke little, worked steadily, attracted no particular attention. To all outward appearances, he was unchanged by what had happened. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. He'd learned that the systems that seemed unbreakable could be broken, that the instruments of oppression could be turned against their wielders, that even the most carefully maintained control could collapse given the right circumstances. He'd also learned that he was capable of things he'd never imagined, both terrible and necessary, and that sometimes the price of that capability was carrying knowledge that could never be shared. On quiet nights, lying in his cabin, he sometimes thought about the whip resting somewhere in the Edisto River. He wondered if it had sunk into the mud or been carried downstream by the current. He wondered if anyone would ever find it, recognize it, understand what it had done and what had been done with it. He wondered if the leather really had absorbed all the suffering it had caused, if his final use of it had somehow balanced accounts that needed balancing. These thoughts disturbed him, suggesting as they did a worldview that made violence meaningful rather than merely tragic. But they also provided a kind of comfort, offering narrative to actions that might otherwise have been merely senseless. Years passed. Marcus grew older, his back more bent from years of labor, his hands more scarred from work. He survived things that should have killed him. Disease, injury, the casual brutalities that were constant features of plantation life. He saw overseers come and go, some worse than Pritchard, some less terrible, but none quite matching that particular combination of systematic cruelty and mechanical precision. Eventually, the war came, bringing with it the chaos and destruction that would finally end the system that had defined Marcus's life. But that's another story, one that belongs to history books rather than to this particular tale. This story ends in 1825 in November with a whip at the bottom of a South Carolina river, and a man who learned that sometimes objects carry weight beyond their physical form, that sometimes suffering accumulates until it finds a way to balance itself, that sometimes the instruments designed to break people become instruments of breaking free. Whether Marcus ever told anyone the truth, whether he carried his secret to his grave or eventually shared it with someone he trusted, is lost to time. The historical record, such as it is, says only that Samuel Pritchard died in an accident on November 12, 1825, that the death was investigated and found to be precisely what it appeared to be, a tragic fall during a fevered confusion. Sometimes the truth hides in plain sight, disguised as exactly what people expect to see. Sometimes the instruments of oppression carry their own weight of accumulated suffering, waiting for a moment of return. Sometimes a man pushed beyond endurance finds a way to push back. And sometimes, in the dark waters of a South Carolina river, an object sinks and is forgotten, carrying with it a history written in scars and blood, a story that will never be fully told, but will always be remembered by those who bore its marks. The whip is gone. The scars remain. The story, like all such stories, refuses to be completely buried.